This is Arnold Cohen from the Housing Community Development Network of New Jersey. Want to welcome you to this webinar that we're doing along with Monarch Housing Associates. Being here in New Jersey, both the network and Monarch collaborate on a lot of our federal advocacy. And as we've seen from sequester, what is happening with the federal budget, we're in for some very tough times, and it's more important now than ever for us to know what's happening on the federal level and be able to figure out ways that we in New Jersey are doing our best to be able to secure the funding that we need to be able to do the wonderful job that is being done throughout the state. So we brought in two of our key national partners, National Alliance to End Homelessness and National Income Housing Coalition, to be helping us understand what's happening on the federal level and how we can be most effective. I'm going to turn it over now to Kate Kelly from Monarch Housing.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kate Kelly. I work with Monarch Housing. And Arnold, do you want me to go ahead and start with introducing Kate?
Yeah.
Okay. It's my pleasure to introduce Kate CF, who some of you may already be been in touch with her or have gotten emails from her. Kate is the Policy Outreach Coordinator with the National Alliance to End Homelessness. And in her role, she works to mobilize advocates across the country to advance policy priorities around preventing and ending homelessness across the country. And she's been a great resource to us here in New Jersey with giving us, up-to-date information around action alerts and other steps we should be taking at the federal level. So, Kate, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Kate. So my name is Kate Seif. It's pronounced Seif. It's a tough one.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. And yes, I'm here in D.C. So if we could get the first slide up. And I just wanted to talk specifically about what's happening sort of in Congress and what's happened in the last few weeks and days, but with a focus centering on McKinney-Vento homeless assistance grants. So the Continuum of Care and ESG programs under the McKinney-Vento homeless assistance grants within the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So up on your screen right now, you see sort of a chart that explains where things sort of stand at the moment in terms of funding for McKinney-Vento. I'll get into a little bit about the NOFA that should maybe be coming out soon, but this is for FY2014 funding, and as I think you all know, we're technically in fiscal year 2014, but the funding for that year hasn't been finalized. So here are the different proposals that have been presented for FY 2014. Of course, there is a different one for the Senate, House, and the President. The President releases a budget proposal. The Senate and House release specific funding bills for HUD, and these are the levels they came out with. As you can see, the President has the best. It's 2.381, and it kind of says what it would do there. Obviously, it would be a huge increase for ESG. It would also get us back to pre-sequestration cuts. So the cuts that are going to come out in the next NOFA, which again I'll talk about in a minute, it would get us it would put that money back, and then even a little bit more for even new projects. And then the House and Senate has slightly worse numbers, with the House coming far below. To put this in perspective, all three of these are an increase in FY 2013, even after sequestration. McKinney-Vento received $1.929 billion. So all of these are, a decent increase. The Senate number is probably the most reasonable, what we're sort of aiming for, this 2.26. It wouldn't have enough money for new projects, but it would still be an increase for ESG, and it would take us back to the pre-sequestration cuts. So that's good. And then to get into a little more detail about how things came to be on the next slide. Basically how things got to be. So those numbers up on the screen previously on that chart were kind of, I would say, old numbers. I'm not sure that I want to say they're not relevant anymore, but they were proposals that happened, in April and July and August. And as you know, a lot has happened since then. So of course, we're still kind of dealing with the effects of a government shutdown that started on October 1st. Again, that's the beginning of fiscal year 2014. And as I mentioned, they didn't have a deal, they didn't have a budget in place, so the government shut down. I think a lot of you probably noticed that the impact on homelessness and housing was very minimal during that shutdown. During those 17 days, there were some administrative delays. There were some problems with the administration of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act programs. But in terms of McKinney and, mostly Section 8 and public housing, there weren't many issues there. Those programs are all considered sort of essential. They weren't using FY2014 funds at the moment. So that wasn't an issue. Now, there was a giant deal struck to open the government. On October 17th, government reopened, and there was a big negotiation that included a bunch of different things, some of which will dramatically impact funding. One of the key things, October 17th was the date because that was sort of the drop-dead date for the debt ceiling. I won't get into the details of the debt ceiling. I don't think it's relevant here. I think we also all probably have a decent idea of all that. But what the deal did was essentially it suspended the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling, as you know, kind of keeps being this issue that we come against. So they sort of just halted that. So they suspended the debt ceiling. The nation doesn't technically have a debt ceiling right now, so we can sort of spend and borrow as needed until February 7th when we will revisit that. I'm not sure why it was February 7th. I think it was just sort of a date in the future at some point after this January 15th deadline, which is the next bullet you see. So right now the government is funded at FY 2013 levels until January 13th, which means all the funding levels that were provided post-sequestration, so post-cuts to FY 2013 spending, is now what we're operating under for January 15th. And I'll get into what that means for McKinney in a minute, but at the moment it essentially means nothing. It doesn't impact it. And then at the same time, this deal included this conference committee. So certain members of the House and Senate would come together and finally figure out and agree on a top line fiscal year 2014 spending level. Part of the reason those numbers in that previous chart were so different between the House and Senate was that the House and Senate were operating just under completely different spending levels. So that was a problem. The House had a much lower level than the Senate, so the House's levels for everything were much lower. So they need to come together and come up with this sort of top-line number for all federal spending for the year. And then possibility of that would be to address sequestration. So next, what's going to happen? So the NOFA should be coming out soon. I know this is a big frustration for everyone, and I wish I could give you a date or some more information. Unfortunately, we have no idea. We work with HUD, but HUD doesn't tell us anything about this, so I know it's frustrating. The one thing I will say about it is that it will have cuts. We anticipate, based on sort of just our assessment of the sequestration cuts and the funding level that was provided, each COC is going to need to make about 8% cut, which is pretty significant. So it's not going to be a tier 1, tier 2 thing. It's going to be you will need to make cuts. You'll need to find 8% of your programs and cut them. We're not sure how that will sort of play out and how that will be implemented and what guidance or requirements HUD will offer, but that's just sort of an FYI for you. So I know that when the NOFA comes out, everyone's immediately busy and there's a tight turnaround deadline and there's a lot to do. But I would really appreciate if everyone on this call sort of understands two things about the NOFA. One, that this isn't HUD. HUD doesn't decide like, well, we're going to cut your programs and this is how we're going to do it. They have really been working in the past few years with very limited funds to alleviate things as much as possible. This is simply a result of members of Congress not being able to agree on a budget and sequestration and debt ceiling issues, and basically just this push to cut. This is what we're seeing. This is nothing to do with HUD implementing the program. This is Congress cutting funding. So it's a great opportunity to reach out to Congress, before you sit down in your NOFA, before you figure it all out, give your member of Congress a quick call and say, are you kidding me? I have to do this now. This is going to be so difficult. We anticipate having to, serve this many fewer people. This many more people will be homeless in our district because of these cuts. I think that's really important to do when you see the NOFA. If you are going to have cuts, if your program will need to make cuts, your COC will need to make cuts, you need to tell Congress. Sequestration and these cuts and this sort of push to just reduce federal spending is having a direct impact on their constituents and your programs and what's happening in the district. To go back to this conference committee, like I said, they could come up with a top line number. Now, it's important to know that they don't have a legal requirement to do so. It's sort of, they came up with this. It's non-binding. So they could come up with something and it could not be used. They don't necessarily have to come up with something, but it's possible that they could. They have a deadline, a self-imposed deadline of December 13th, so a month from today, to come up with something. And then at that point, they will move forward with FY2014 funding. That could happen really quickly once they come up with a number, and that would be great. We would have solid, it wouldn't just be another CR like we've been doing the past few years. It would be legitimate new spending bills. Or, as it says, they could fail. We could end up with sequestration cuts. Sequestration could be alleviated. It could be made worse for non-defense programs. Or we could, once again, see that another full year CR with programs, many programs at this point, operating under fiscal year 2011 funding levels, which is just terrible. So what's the impact on McKinney? On the next slide. So the full year CR, that would be probably the worst case scenario. It would mean, simply put, more cuts in the next NOFA. So the FY2014 NOFA that will come out later in 2014 will have even more cuts. So you'll cut this year and then be required to cut next year. Alternatively, that CR, which is a continuing resolution, which is just a stopgap funding measure in place of real funding bills, sorry for the jargon, it could include anomalies, which are basically they take a copy of last year's funding, paste it onto this year, but make a few tweaks. Last year, McKinney was one of those little tweaks. It could be again this year. That remains to be seen. The conference committee could, like I said, alleviate sequestration for a year or two, which would be fantastic. That would be more money for HUD. Or, as I mentioned, they could make it worse. They could alleviate some of the cuts on the defense side, enhance them on the non-defense side, which, of course, includes HUD funding, which would ultimately mean less money for HUD next year, which would be bad. If there is an actual budget, if they come up with this top line number and then the appropriators need to make, those spending decisions, they need to allot that top line funding level number into each federal program, McKinney could fare well. It's a program targeted toward, our lowest income, most vulnerable people. It has done, all things considered, pretty well, and I think that if we had an actual budget with both parties and both chambers at the table, things could go pretty well. So that's kind of where things stand. On the next slide, you'll see my contact information, and I'll be around till the end. I know that was a lot of information in a quick period of time. So if you have any questions or anything, please don't hesitate to let me know. There's my information. You can also click on that link. Don't worry about the call-in week materials. I'm not sure why that's up there. But the link, the FY2014 McKinney campaign, has a ton of more information, one-pagers, talking points, and everything you need to reach out to your members about all this. But again, any questions, please feel free to let me know.
Thank you so much, Kate. This is Arnold Cohen again. I want to introduce our next speaker, Sham Manglock from National Income Housing Coalition. She's their senior policy analyst, and she will talk about the National Income Housing Coalition's campaign to try to get us more dollars to address the tremendous housing needs that we have, especially for very low-income people, in terms of trying to get dollars to fund the National Housing Trust Fund. So let me turn over to Sham.
Thanks,
Thanks, Arnold. Hi, everyone. I'm Sean with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and I'm going to talk primarily about the United for Homes campaign to fund the National Housing Trust Fund through changes to the mortgage and trust deduction. And then I'll also touch upon other efforts that we're pursuing to find funding for the trust fund and other off-budget sources. Next slide, please. So I'm sure that all of you are familiar with the National Housing Trust Fund, but just as a quick refresher, the trust fund was authorized in 2008 in the Housing and Economic Recovery Act. The trust fund was initially supposed to be funded by contributions from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, but they went into conservatorship shortly after the trust fund was authorized and never made a single contribution. We are pursuing money from Fannie and Freddie now, but what's important to remember is HERA also said that Congress could designate any other funding sources they wanted to the trust fund as well. And so that's what we're doing with the United for Homes campaign. So the trust fund dollars, once there is money in the trust fund, can be used to build, preserve, rehabilitate, operate rental housing that's affordable to extremely low-income renter households. In fact, 75% of the funds have to go to extremely low-income renter households, and then all of the funds must serve very low-income renter households. 90% of the funds have to go to rental housing, and up to 10% of the funds can be used for first-time homeownership activities. The trust fund is a block grant that goes to states, and states really have a lot of flexibility on how they use their trust fund dollars to meet local goals. We expect that many states will use trust fund funding to perhaps implement their 10-year plans to end homelessness. It could also be used to rehabilitate vacant and foreclosed properties. There is a funding formula that's already established based on need. Just as an example, if there were $5 billion allocated to the trust fund, New Jersey would get $168,600,000. So that's quite significant. So tax reform is something that's been percolating in Congress for the last few years. And while we've always used the mortgage and trust deduction as kind of a rhetorical tool to show how much the federal government subsidizes home ownership over rental housing, in the last year or two, there's been increased momentum and energy around modifying the mortgage and trust deduction to make it better targeted. So this is a really great moment. The United for Homes campaign proposes two pretty minor changes to the mortgage and trust deduction that would raise revenue that could then be applied to the National Housing Trust Fund to eliminate the gap in affordable rental housing for extremely low-income households. So there are two changes. The first is lowering the cap on the size of a mortgage for which a household can get a tax break from $1 million to $500,000. And then the second change is converting the deduction to a 15% non-refundable credit. And we propose that these changes be phased in over 5 years. So, there are benefits in terms of raising money, and then also benefits for homeowners. Next slide, please. So even irrespective of raising money, we think that these changes are good policy. Under our proposal, 16 million additional homeowners would get a tax break for the interest that they pay on their mortgage. This comes from changing it from a deduction to a credit, because all of a sudden people who pay interest on their mortgage but who don't itemize on their taxes will still be able to get a tax break. Of this increase, 99% of these households have incomes under $100,000. So really targeting these government benefits to households with lower incomes. And then, of course, these changes would raise revenue. So we propose that the changes are phased in over 5 years. And then over 10 years, the changes would raise $197 billion. We propose that this money be applied to the National Housing Trust Fund, and if this trust fund were funded at this level, it would make a significant dent in ending homelessness by expanding the supply of affordable housing. So there are a couple of ways that you and your organizations can help support this campaign. The first is that you or your organization can endorse the campaign, and you can do that either by contacting me or going on our website. We are trying to have, we have over 1,200 endorsers right now of state, local, and federal organizations, but this endorser list is really what makes an impression when we go pitch the proposal to offices on the Hill. The second thing you can do is there is legislation that advances the goals of the United for Homes campaign that's been introduced in the House of Representatives. The bill is H.R. 1213, the Common Sense Housing Investment Act. It's been introduced by Keith Ellison, and it includes the 2 changes to the mortgage interest deduction that I described earlier. And the bill will put the majority of the savings achieved through this to the National Housing Trust Fund. So we are actively seeking co-sponsors and would ask that you ask your representatives in the House to co-sponsor the bill. Next slide, please. And so just as an FYI, I won't get into the specific details about this, but please feel free to ask questions if you do have some. So like I said earlier, the initial source of money for the trust fund was supposed to be contributions from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The Senate Banking Committee is now working on housing finance reform legislation that would create a successor entity or entities to Fannie and Freddie. We want to make sure that the trust fund remains in any housing finance reform legislation and any future system. There is a bill that's been introduced in the Senate, the Corker-Warner bill, that includes the trust fund but has some sort of drafting changes or drafting issues to it. But nonetheless, the chair and ranking member of the Banking Committee are going to have their own legislation. So we're trying to make sure that the trust fund is included and improved upon from the Corker-Warner bill. Just one quick side note, the GSE funding is nowhere near the amount that would be achieved from changes to the mortgage interest deduction. So we really need both to help solve the problem. And then the next slide is just my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or need more information. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. This is Arnold Cohn again, and just want to bring this back, and with Kay Kelly, we'll be talking about some of the things that we can be doing in New Jersey, some of the events coming up, and then talk further about how we can be working together here in New Jersey. What you have before your screen is a excellent short video that was done by the National Income Housing Coalition's United for Homes campaign. I urge you to take a look at it. They do a really excellent job describing the trust fund and what the trust fund can be doing, and it's a really good way to just spread the word and inform other people about this critical piece of a campaign that, again, as we're in arena, as we heard from the Homeless Alliance, they're talking about cuts. They're talking about 8% cuts. What we've seen with home and CDBG are even much more drastic cuts, and we sorely need a National Housing Trust Fund so we can talk about new resources to be able to address those desperate needs that we have here in New Jersey and throughout the nation. Next slide, Richard. Want to invite you all to the Housing Community Development Network's annual conference and membership meeting, which is coming up on December 11th. And this is going to be, we're kicking off our 25th anniversary year, a little commercial here. And this is a way in which you can meet your other colleagues that are working in the field and being able to strategize and work together in terms of how we can address advocacy on a federal level. What we're going to be having in the morning is Affinity Roundtables, and there's going to be a roundtable for homeless providers and advocates that Richard Brown from Monarch Housing is going to help coordinate, along with Connie Mercer from Homefront and Betsy Hall from Homeless Solutions in Morris County, so that we can be talking together statewide about how we can help address these issues. Next slide. So this is the registration link for the conference. So next I'd like to talk about the Lobby Day. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition has an excellent conference in March, and each year they end the conference with a Lobby Day. This year it's going to be on March 19th, and what we do with the network at Monarch is set up meetings with each member of our congressional delegation. We have the advantage of being close by in New Jersey to Washington. So what we do is try to set up the meetings starting in the afternoon so that you can not have to wake up at an ungodly hour to make it down to Washington that day. And we end our meetings typically by 3, 4 o'clock so that you can be home at a decent hour. So it's something that, obviously if you can join the conference, it's really well worth your time, but if you can't, it's a day trip that will enable you to join us to be able to have that face-to-face time with your members of Congress. And then we do the same thing again in July with the National Alliance to End Homelessness at their conference. So it's a chance where we're able to then talk directly in DC to the staff. In addition to that, there's activities that we could be doing in state. This is just a photo from Hill Day. All those happy faces.
And just if I could interrupt for 1 second,
sure,
Arnold, this is Kate Kelly. I think something about this photo, that's a photo with with one of our members of Congress. And so you sometimes at these meetings have an opportunity not only to meet with the staff, but the actual member, which is a really great opportunity. So it's just another reason to come down to DC for those meetings.
Absolutely. And then what you have here is just the how lobbying makes a difference, and those relationships that you're building with that congressional office, for them to know about your project, what you're doing within the district. You never know how that can really be invaluable to helping you succeed as an organization. I mean, we've seen everything from, where there's, in the days where there was discretionary funding for somebody, a congressman, to be able to help gear dollars, to actually helping with, writing something on behalf of the organization with your own fundraising letters. So in addition to helping support policy initiatives, it's a way to really help your own organization succeed. Next slide. So, and this is just really more of the same. And again, so to stress, it's more than just that one-time meeting, but it's continuing to stay in touch with the person that you met with in DC and letting them know on an ongoing basis, because as we heard from Kate and Sham, there is a very changing landscape. We cannot predict right now what the landscape around federal funding is going to be like in January, February, or as we go further into the year.
And I think, just so I can add to that, Arnold,
Please.
this is Kate Kelly again. With the site visits, having them come out and see your housing programs in your community and showing them what's going on in their district is just a great opportunity for the members. They can hear from constituents directly, the folks who have benefited from living in the housing. They can see how the housing policy and the federal funding is being, the policy being implemented and the funding being spent, and it's some great publicity for the members themselves. You know, a great photo opportunity, and even to get some news items, news articles in the papers and on the news websites, PR for themselves and for their office. And there's nothing like having that face-to-face contact to build a stronger relationship. So again, that, like as Arnold said, the site visits are a good continuation from meetings in DC on Lobby Day.
And it gives them something when they're on the floor of Congress to be talking about, in my district, this is what's happening. It's having that face of somebody who's benefiting from those dollars that's coming from Congress has an emotional impact beyond any letters or calls or anything else we can have. So in some ways, the site visits and having them meet people that are benefiting because of federal dollars coming into the district, it can be really invaluable. One of the things that we did was working with folks in Camden and their Homeless Network Planning Committee, and we had 2 site visits with Congressman Andrews. In addition, we had an event in Camden where let me just stay according to script here. So, when Congressman Andrews toured supportive housing sites, again, the advantage of him being able to meet somebody who, formerly a homeless person, being turned away from shelters, but then being able to move into a new apartment, and Congressman Andrews being able to know, okay, here is the face that I can put to somebody who was actually helped by those federal dollars. And there's just the photo of earlier this year. We brought Congressman Andrews' work with groups in Camden to have a hearing on sequestration where 75 people participated in the forum, and the congressman was able to then talk directly to people, and people within Camden were able to tell their own stories, both from the different institutions that were getting federal dollars like Housing Authority, as well as people being able to talk about how sequestrations affected their own lives. So you're able to tell a real human story that they got picked up by the press. And again, it's part of a whole, it's part of our efforts to really be able to influence Congress by getting people like Congressman Andrews, who is spokespeople for us, out into the field and working with us. And we hope to be doing more of these in other congressional districts, and be more than happy to work with any of you on the call to pull together something similar in your district. Kate, do you want to?
Sure. We've heard some great examples from both the National Alliance on Homelessness and the National Low-Income Housing Coalition about how advocacy matters, and it really can be one of the best ways to impact public policy. We can work with policymakers, our delegation in Washington, and really work together to increase the resources so that we truly can end homelessness here in the United States. We're in a climate right now where we're going to be pushing back to avoid cuts, but it also can't hurt, to also think about in the future where the possibility of working once again to increase resources to end homelessness. The next slide, please. And as we've talked about through this webinar, the Network in Monarch Housing, we work very regularly with our national partners, and we are very ready to help you in your districts with your local members of Congress to set up site visits for, and happy to provide you with, and we try to provide you with the tools that we need to have effective lobby and Hill days down in Washington. You know, there's also the opportunity to do the same sort of lobby days and site visits with our New Jersey legislature, the folks that represent us in Trenton, because the budget battles are taking place both at the federal and the state level, and now more than ever, it really is the time to make our voices heard. Next slide, please. Again, just to reiterate the examples of what we can do, joining in the lobby and Hill days, keeping in touch with the housing staffers in the DC offices by both email and you know, calling them on the phone too is also very helpful. We have on our website, and we provide a link to it whenever we have an action alert, we've worked with the offices in Washington to find out who their housing staffers are. So we try to make it as easy for you as possible. If we send you an email asking you to email or call the housing staffers, you can then go to this document and find out their names, their email addresses, their phone numbers, and those are the specific staff in the Washington, D.C. offices assigned to work on housing and probably some other issues, but they are assigned to housing. Monarch Housing sends out action alerts through our daily emails that go out that brings you to posts on our website. So when we hear from our partners at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and at the National Alliance on Homelessness, that now is the time to reach out about an issue such as what Kate spoke about after the NOFA comes out, letting our members know the effect that the cuts would have on funding, or what Sham talked about, asking our members to sign on as co-sponsors of the trust fund. We try to keep you updated on those types of opportunities through our advocacy alerts. And we've certainly found that communication does make a difference. If you start off by responding to our action alerts and emailing the housing staffers of your members, it's just a good way for them to get to know you and to know that you too can be a resource for them. Next slide, please.
And this is Arnold. So, you know, the network has a weekly email update, and, you know, the Housing Community Development Network works on a larger issue. We're also looking at dollars there for housing production, you know, what's happening with home, community development block grants, the Sandy issue, housing counseling. So we take a broader view in terms of housing development, which obviously is a corollary to ending homelessness. Great, Kate.
And then Monarch, we have our, that I spoke about, our email newsletter, and the link is there to sign up for those emails. And then, you know, when you get our action alerts, we ask you to share them with your list of folks that you may work with at the local level. You know, encouraging your colleagues and your allies to also reach out to the members of Congress. We really try to make it as simple as possible, taking the lead again from our national partners, whether it's on regarding HUD funding or whether it's the Housing Trust Fund or the other issues we've talked about. We really try to give you simple messages that you can send to the members about why it's so important for them to either sign on to something to increase funding or to, you know, take another policy action. Next slide, please.
So
and just in conclusion,
I'm sorry, Kate. No, go ahead.
Just in conclusion, we want to make sure that everyone on this call has the contact information for Arnold at the network and for Richard or I at Monarch. And please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you're interested in pursuing a site visit, if you want to make sure we keep you up to speed on lobby days that are happening in Washington, if you want to make sure you're getting our action alerts, or if you ever have a question about an action alert that goes out, we really hope that you'll reach out to us so that we can be as helpful as we can.
Okay. So are we taking questions?
Yes, we can do that.
Okay. If there's any questions that anybody has for any of the speakers,